Welcome to No Sleep Historian, where the past never rests, and neither should you. Royalty was never just about gold, crowns, and thrones. Beneath the grandeur lay a festering truth, one hidden behind portraits and bloodlines. The same blood that cemented dynasties also carried curses, deformities, and madness. This is the true cost of keeping power in the family. The blood that binds. Dark history of royal inbreeding. Part 1. The origins of blood purity obsession. In the beginning, there was blood. Not just any blood, but blood believed to flow with the essence of gods themselves. The ancient world birthed an obsession that would span millennia and topple empires. The concept of divine blood didn't emerge from science or reason, it crawled from the darkest corners of human ambition, wrapped in religious mysticism and political necessity. The earliest civilizations understood something fundamental about power. It wasn't enough to conquer lands or amass wealth. True dominion required legitimacy, and legitimacy required divine sanction. The Sumerians, arguably the world's first organized civilization, developed the concept of the divine king around 3000 BCE. Their rulers weren't merely appointed by gods. They were descendants of gods, carrying celestial blood through mortal veins. This belief system spread like wildfire across the ancient world. The Egyptians perfected it. Their pharaohs weren't just kings, but living gods, divine vessels, housing the soul of Horus, while living and joining Osiris in death. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. If royal blood was divine, mixing it with common blood would dilute its power. The solution seemed obvious, but would prove catastrophic. Keep the blood pure. Keep it in the family. The pharaoh, Akhenaten, who ruled from 1351 to 1334 BCE, married his sister Nefertiti. This wasn't unusual, it was expected. Egyptian royal siblings regularly married each other to preserve the sacred bloodline. The practice was so normalized that pharaohs often married multiple sisters, half-sisters, and even their own daughters. The royal family trees of ancient Egypt look less like trees and more like wreaths, circles upon circles of intermarried relatives. Archaeological evidence reveals the devastating consequences. Tutankhamun, perhaps Egypt's most famous pharaoh, was the product of sibling marriage. DNA analysis conducted in 2010 revealed that his parents were full brother and sister. The young king's body tells a story of genetic devastation. He suffered from multiple congenital disorders, including a cleft palate, clubfoot, and severe spinal curvature. His immune system was so compromised that what should have been minor injuries proved fatal. He died at approximately 18 years old, his divine blood ultimately becoming his curse. But Egypt wasn't alone in this obsession. Ancient Persia adopted similar practices, with the Achaemenid dynasty regularly practicing royal incest. The Persian word exvedida literally meant self-marriage and was considered a religious virtue among the royal class. Zoroastrian texts actively encouraged these unions, believing they strengthened the cosmic order. The Greeks initially viewed these practices with horror. Herodotus wrote extensively about the barbaric customs of Persian kings marrying their sisters and daughters. Yet, even Greek mythology normalized divine incest. Zeus married his sister, Hera, and their dysfunctional relationship became the template for divine power structures. This mythological precedent would later influence Hellenistic kingdoms, particularly the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. The Romans, practical as always, initially rejected incestuous marriages as foreign corruption. However, as the empire grew and absorbed Eastern territories, these practices began to seep into Roman culture. By the time of the late Empire, marriages between uncles and nieces were not only legal but common among the aristocracy. The underlying psychology of blood purity obsession reveals itself when we examine the political motivations. Royal families faced a fundamental problem. How do you maintain power across generations when surrounded by ambitious nobles, foreign enemies, and rebellious subjects? The answer lay in creating an ideology so powerful that questioning royal authority became tantamount to questioning the gods themselves. Divine blood provided the perfect justification. Rulers weren't accountable to human laws or morality. They were conduits of divine will. Marrying within the family wasn't just about preserving bloodline purity. It was about maintaining a monopoly on divinity. Every child born to royal siblings was another vessel for divine power, another heir who couldn't be challenged on grounds of legitimacy. The economic factors were equally compelling. Royal marriages were political alliances, trading partnerships, and military pacts rolled into one. When a king married his sister, he wasn't sharing power with a foreign dynasty or creating potential succession disputes with distant relatives. The throne remained firmly within the immediate family. Wealth stayed concentrated, and political control remained absolute. Religious institutions enthusiastically supported these practices because they benefited from the arrangement. Priests gained prestige by serving divine rulers, while temples received generous donations from families desperate to maintain their divine status. The higher the pedestal they placed royalty upon, the more important their role as intermediaries between gods and mortals became. Archaeological evidence from various ancient civilizations reveals the physical toll of this ideology. Skeletal remains from royal burial sites consistently show higher rates of genetic disorders, developmental abnormalities, and premature death compared to common populations. Yet these obvious warning signs were ignored or rationalized away. Physical deformities were reinterpreted as marks of divine favor. Mental illness became evidence of mystical connection to other realms. The ancient Chinese developed their own version of blood purity, obsession with the mandate of heaven. While they didn't practice direct sibling marriage as extensively as Middle Eastern cultures, they maintained rigid bloodline requirements for succession. Chinese emperors often married within very small circles of noble families, creating genetic bottlenecks that persisted for centuries. In the Americas, similar patterns emerged independently. The Inca believed their rulers descended from Inti, the sun god. Royal siblings regularly married to preserve divine blood, with the Sapa Inca often taking his sister as his primary wife. The nobility followed suit, creating isolated genetic pools that concentrated both power and genetic disorders within ruling classes. The psychological impact on individuals born into these systems cannot be understated. Royal children grew up believing they were fundamentally different from other humans closer to gods than mortals. This belief system created a dangerous sense of entitlement and separation from reality that would plague royal families for millennia. Documents from ancient libraries revealed that some scholars recognized the genetic problems early on. Babylonian texts describe certain royal families as cursed, producing children with recurring health problems and mental instabilities. However, these observations were suppressed or reinterpreted through religious frameworks that blamed spiritual corruption rather than biological reality. The spread of blood, purity, obsession wasn't random. It followed trade routes and conquest patterns. As empires expanded and cultures mingled, ruling classes shared not only technologies and luxuries, but also ideologies of power. The concept of divine blood became a universal tool for justifying inequality and maintaining control across diverse populations. By the end of the ancient period, the foundation was set for centuries of genetic devastation. What began as a political solution to legitimacy problems had evolved into an unshakable religious conviction. Royal families across the world had convinced themselves and their subjects that their blood was literally divine, and that mixing it with common blood would bring cosmic disaster. The stage was set for the medieval and early modern periods, when European dynasties would take these ancient practices to their logical extreme, creating some of the most genetically damaged ruling families in human history. The obsession with blood purity that began in ancient temple complexes would ultimately topple empires and change the course of world history. Part 2. Habsburg Horror, the empire that imploded. If ancient civilizations planted the seeds of royal inbreeding, the Habsburg dynasty cultivated them into a garden of genetic horrors that stretched across centuries and continents. What began as a minor noble family in the Swiss Alps would become the most powerful dynasty in European history and, ultimately, one of the most genetically compromised ruling houses ever documented. The Habsburg story begins in 1020 with Radbot of Kletgo, who built Habsburg Castle in present-day Switzerland. The family name itself comes from Habsburg, meaning Hawk's Castle. For the first few centuries, the Habsburgs were unremarkable among European nobility. Their transformation into a genetic catastrophe began with a simple political strategy that would define their dynasty for the next 700 years. Marriage as conquest. Rudolf I became Holy Roman Emperor in 1273, establishing the Habsburg tradition of using strategic marriages to expand territory and influence. His motto, which would echo through generations, was Bella Gerant Ali, to Felix Austria Nubi, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. This seemingly clever diplomatic approach would prove to be their downfall. The Habsburg method was mathematically elegant and biologically disastrous. Instead of conquering territories through warfare, they acquired them through carefully orchestrated marriages. A Habsburg daughter would marry a foreign prince to secure an alliance. When that prince died without male heirs, Habsburg blood would claim the throne. Within a few generations, the family controlled vast territories across Europe through this matrimonial strategy. The genetic problems began subtly. Early Habsburg marriages were strategic, but not particularly incestuous by medieval standards. However, as their empire expanded, the family faced an increasingly complex challenge. How do you maintain control over territories spanning from Spain to Hungary while keeping political power concentrated within your bloodline? Their solution was catastrophic. Beginning in the 15th century, the Habsburgs began systematically marrying within their own family. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and in some cases, the family tree became so tangled that individuals carried identical genes from multiple ancestors. What started as political calculation evolved into genetic Russian roulette. Emperor Maximilian I, who ruled from 1493 to 1519, exemplifies the early stages of Habsburg genetic concentration. He married Mary of Burgundy, a strategic alliance that brought vast territories under Habsburg control. However, their son Philip the handsome married Joanna of Castile, beginning a pattern of increasingly close family marriages that would define the dynasty. The Spanish Habsburg line, established through Philip and Joanna's marriage, became a laboratory for human genetic experimentation. Charles V, their son, inherited territories spanning from Germany to Peru, creating the largest empire in European history. To maintain control over this vast domain, he married his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal, in 1526. Their son, Philip II, would continue this pattern by marrying 4 wives, 3 of whom were his relatives. Philip II's marriage to his niece, Anna of Austria, in 1570 represents a turning point in Habsburg genetics. Anna was not just his niece, she was also his double cousin, sharing great-grandparents on both sides of her family. Their children carried genetic loads that would have been impossible in normal populations. Don Carlos, Philip's son from his first marriage, displayed severe mental instability, physical deformities, and sadistic tendencies that shocked even the brutal standards of 16th century royalty. The mathematical progression of Habsburg inbreeding follows a predictable pattern. Each generation became more genetically compromised than the last, as the family's gene pool contracted to a fraction of normal human diversity. By the 17th century, Spanish Habsburgs were more closely related to each other than typical siblings in the general population. Charles II of Spain, who ruled from 1665 to 1700, represents the culmination of Habsburg genetic disaster. Modern genetic analysis reveals that his coefficient of inbreeding was 0.254, higher than the offspring of full siblings. His family tree contains only 32 unique ancestors in 6 generations, compared to the normal 64. Some individuals appear multiple times in his lineage, contributing identical genetic material through multiple pathways. Contemporary accounts describe Charles II as barely functional. He couldn't chew solid food due to his severely malformed jaw, a condition now known as the Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism. His tongue was so large that his speech was largely incomprehensible. He suffered from chronic digestive problems, frequent seizures, and what modern doctors would recognize as severe developmental delays. The Spanish court went to extraordinary lengths to hide Charles II's condition from the public. Official portraits were painted to minimize his deformities, using careful angles and artistic license to suggest normal human proportions. Diplomatic correspondence describes elaborate protocols designed to prevent foreign ambassadors from seeing the king's face clearly or hearing him speak at length. More disturbing were the king's mental and emotional problems. Court documents describe episodes of uncontrollable rage, periods of catatonic withdrawal, and disturbing obsessions with death and torture. He spent hours in the royal crypt, talking to the decomposed remains of his ancestors. His marriage to Marie-Louise was childless and reportedly never consummated his physical and mental condition, made normal marital relations impossible. The Habsburg jaw became the dynasty's signature deformity, passed down through generations with mathematical precision. This protruding lower jaw, often accompanied by severe tooth overcrowding and speech impediments, appears in family portraits spanning centuries. Modern orthodontists studying Habsburg skulls have identified the genetic mutation responsible, a recessive trait that became dominant through repeated inbreeding. But the Habsburg jaw was just the most visible symptom of deeper genetic problems. The family suffered from a constellation of inherited disorders, including epilepsy, mental retardation, infertility, and immune system deficiencies. Infant mortality rates among Habsburg children reached staggering levels, with many dynastically important births resulting in stillborn children or infants who died within days. The Austrian branch of the Habsburg family fared somewhat better, primarily because they occasionally married outside the immediate family circle. However, even they couldn't escape the genetic legacy entirely. Maria Theresa, who ruled Austria from 1740 to 1780, married her second cousin, Francis I, while she was personally more capable than her Spanish relatives. Several of her children displayed classic Habsburg traits, including mental instability and physical deformities. The economic and political consequences of Habsburg genetic decline were staggering. As rulers became less capable of governing effectively, administrative control shifted to court bureaucrats and noble advisors. The empire's military effectiveness declined as genetically compromised leaders made increasingly poor strategic decisions. Economic policies became erratic, reflecting the mental instability of rulers who couldn't understand complex governmental issues. The Spanish succession crisis that followed Charles II's death in 1700 demonstrates how genetic devastation can trigger international warfare. Charles died without heirs, having been physically incapable of producing children. His death sparked the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that involved every major European power and resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties. The war wasn't just about territorial ambitions, it was about cleaning up the genetic mess that centuries of Habsburg inbreeding had created. Contemporary physicians and court observers recognized that something was seriously wrong with the Habsburg bloodline, though they lacked the scientific framework to understand genetics. Medical records from the period describe recurring family ailments and inherited weaknesses that affected Habsburg children generation after generation. Some doctors recommended marriages outside the family, but these suggestions were ignored for political reasons. The Habsburg genetic legacy extends beyond individual rulers to encompass institutional decay. As the family became increasingly incapable of effective leadership, the empire's administrative systems atrophied. Corruption flourished as mentally compromised rulers couldn't maintain oversight of government operations. Military effectiveness declined as strategic decision-making became increasingly erratic. The dynasty's obsession with bloodline purity ultimately achieved the opposite of its intended goal. Instead of preserving divine royal blood, centuries of inbreeding created a genetic wasteland that made effective rule impossible. The Habsburg Empire didn't fall because of external enemies or economic collapse, imploded from within, destroyed by the accumulated genetic damage of its ruling family. By the 18th century, even the Habsburgs recognized that their bloodline was unsustainable. Maria Theresa's reforms included subtle changes to marriage practices, allowing more genetic diversity into the family. However, these changes came too late to reverse centuries of genetic accumulation. The Spanish Habsburg line had already gone extinct, and the Austrian branch was permanently weakened. The Habsburg horror story provides a perfect case study in how political strategies can have unintended biological consequences. What began as clever diplomatic maneuvering evolved into a genetic disaster that changed European history. Their empire's collapse wasn't just political, it was biological. The inevitable result of turning human reproduction into a tool of power concentration. Part 3. Blue blood, broken mind, royal insanity. The phrase blue blood supposedly originated from Spanish nobles who claimed their pale skin revealed blue veins, distinguishing them from sun-darkened commoners. But the real story of royal blood is far darker, a centuries-long chronicle of mental illness, genetic disorders, and psychological breakdown hidden beneath ceremonial grandeur. European royalty didn't just suffer from occasional madness, they cultivated it, generation after generation, through bloodlines so concentrated that insanity became their inheritance. Mental illness in royal families wasn't random misfortune. It was the predictable result of genetic bottlenecks that concentrated harmful recessive traits. When cousins marry cousins across multiple generations, rare genetic mutations that normally remain hidden in the general population become commonplace among their descendants. Royal families unknowingly created laboratories for human genetic experimentation, with their own minds as the test subjects. The most infamous case of royal madness belongs to King George III of Britain, whose psychological breakdown during the American Revolution became legend. Modern historians often attribute his condition to porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that affects the nervous system and can cause severe mental symptoms. But George III's madness wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that stretched across European royalty like an epidemic. George III's first major episode occurred in 1788, transforming the dignified monarch into a raving lunatic virtually overnight. Contemporary accounts describe scenes that shocked even hardened courtiers. The king would speak rapidly for hours without pause, his words becoming increasingly disconnected from reality. He developed sexual obsessions, making inappropriate advances toward ladies of the court and discussing intimate matters with complete strangers. Dr. Francis Willis, the king's physician, recorded detailed observations of these episodes. George III would strip naked and run through the palace corridors, believing himself to be various historical figures. During one episode, he insisted he was the Holy Roman Emperor and demanded that his courtiers address him in Latin. He would hold conversations with people who weren't there, gesturing wildly at empty spaces while maintaining intense eye contact with invisible companions. The physical symptoms were equally disturbing. The king's urine turned purple during attacks, a telltale sign of acute porphyria. His skin became extremely sensitive to light, forcing him to remain in darkened rooms for weeks at a time. He suffered from severe abdominal pain that left him writhing on the floor, screaming about demons in his stomach. His speech became slurred and incomprehensible, punctuated by fits of uncontrollable laughter that could last for hours. What makes George III's condition particularly significant is its hereditary nature. Porphyria runs in families, and the Hanoverian bloodline carried this genetic time bomb through multiple generations. George's son, George IV, displayed similar symptoms, including paranoid delusions, violent mood swings, and periods of complete mental incapacitation. The family medical records reveal a pattern of psychological instability that affected nearly every member of the royal line. But porphyria was just one of many genetic disorders plaguing European royalty. The intermarriage of royal families had created a genetic minefield where rare conditions became commonplace. Hemophilia, the bleeding disorder that would later devastate the Russian imperial family, first appeared among the descendants of Queen Victoria. Her son Leopold suffered from the condition, bleeding internally from minor injuries and living in constant fear of accidental death. The psychological impact of growing up royal in these genetically compromised families cannot be understated. Royal children were raised believing they were fundamentally superior to other humans, chosen by God to rule over lesser beings. When genetic disorders began manifesting, the cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could someone chosen by divine providence suffer from such obvious flaws? This contradiction created a unique form of royal neurosis that compounded existing genetic problems. Many royal family members developed elaborate delusions to explain their conditions. They weren't mentally ill, they were receiving divine visions. They weren't physically weak, they were too refined for earthly concerns. These psychological defense mechanisms often made their actual conditions worse by preventing realistic assessment and treatment. The Spanish Habsburg line provides the most extreme examples of genetic mental illness. Philip IV of Spain, who ruled from 1621 to 1665, suffered from severe depression and obsessive-compulsive behaviors that interfered with his ability to govern. He would spend hours arranging and rearranging objects in precise patterns, becoming violently agitated if anyone disturbed his arrangements. Court records describe him sitting motionless for entire days, staring at the wall, while important state business remained unattended. His successor, Charles II, whom we discussed earlier, suffered from what modern psychiatrists would classify as severe intellectual disability combined with psychotic episodes. He believed that his deceased relatives were speaking to him through mirrors and demanded that his food be blessed by 3 different priests before he would eat it. He refused to wash himself for months at a time, claiming that water would wash away his divine essence. The French royal family developed their own constellation of genetic disorders. Louis XI of France, who ruled from 1461 to 1483, displayed clear signs of paranoid schizophrenia. He lived in constant fear of assassination, traveling with a small army of bodyguards and refusing to sleep in the same room twice. He developed elaborate conspiracy theories involving virtually everyone at court and would order executions based on imaginary plots revealed in dreams. The Bourbon line continued this pattern of hereditary mental illness. Louis XIV's brother, Philippe I, Duke of Suffolk, from what contemporary doctors called nervous fits, but modern medicine would recognize as bipolar disorder. His mood swings were legendary periods of manic creativity, followed by deep depressions during which he wouldn't leave his chambers for weeks. Medical records from the 17th and 18th centuries reveal that royal physicians were well aware of the hereditary nature of these conditions. Though they lacked the scientific framework to understand genetics, Dr. Guy Patton, physician to Louis XIV, wrote extensively about the family madness that seemed to plague European nobility. He noted that children of consanguineous marriages were far more likely to develop mental problems than those from unrelated parents. The treatment methods employed by royal physicians often made conditions worse. Bloodletting was a common remedy for excess humors thought to cause madness. Kings and queens would be bled regularly, sometimes to the point of unconsciousness, weakening already compromised immune systems and worsening genetic conditions. Mercury treatments, used for various ailments, caused additional neurological damage that compounded existing genetic problems. Religious interpretations of royal madness created additional complications. When kings claimed divine right to rule, their mental illness became a theological problem. How could God's appointed representative on earth be mentally defective? Various explanations emerged, from divine testing to demonic possession, but none addressed the underlying genetic causes. The impact of royal mental illness on governance was catastrophic. Mentally incompetent rulers made disastrous political decisions that affected millions of people. Wars were declared based on paranoid delusions. Economic policies were implemented during manic episodes and abandoned during depressive phases. The stability of entire nations depended on the mental health of individuals who were genetically predisposed to psychological breakdown. Court life developed elaborate protocols to hide royal mental illness from the public. When King George III became incapacitated, the Regency Act of 1811 was passed to allow his son to rule in his place. But the full extent of the king's condition was kept secret. Similar cover-ups occurred throughout European courts, with regents, advisors, and court officials ruling behind the scenes while maintaining the fiction of royal competence. The genetic basis of royal mental illness becomes clear when examining family trees across multiple generations. The same disorders appear repeatedly in direct bloodlines, following predictable patterns of inheritance. Modern genetic analysis of royal remains has confirmed that many historical cases of madness were actually well-documented genetic conditions that could have been prevented through genetic diversity. The psychological profiles of genetically compromised royals share common characteristics beyond their specific disorders. Most developed grandiose delusions about their own importance, even beyond the normal expectations of royal status. They displayed extreme paranoia about threats to their power, often seeing conspiracies where none existed. Many developed obsessive religious preoccupations, spending hours in prayer or religious ritual while neglecting governmental duties. Perhaps most tragically, many of these rulers were aware that something was wrong with them, but couldn't understand what it was. Medical knowledge of the time provided no explanations for their conditions, leaving them to struggle with symptoms they couldn't comprehend or control. The isolation of royal life meant they had few people they could trust with their fears and struggles. The pattern of royal mental illness finally began to break in the 19th century, as European monarchies started marrying outside their traditional genetic circles. The introduction of new blood from less closely related families helped dilute the concentration of harmful genetic variants. However, the damage from centuries of inbreeding had already been done, and its effects would continue to influence European politics well into the modern era. Part 4. Hemophilia, the royal disease. Of all the genetic curses that plagued European royalty, none proved more politically devastating than hemophilia, the bleeding disorder that earned its grim nickname as the royal disease. What began as a single genetic mutation in Queen Victoria's bloodline spread across the continent like a biological weapon, toppling dynasties and altering the course of world history. This wasn't just a medical condition. It was a political catastrophe disguised as a hereditary illness. Hemophilia is caused by mutations in genes responsible for blood clotting. When someone with hemophilia suffers even minor injuries, their blood cannot clot properly, leading to prolonged bleeding that can be fatal. Internal bleeding is particularly dangerous, as it can occur without obvious trauma and damage vital organs. Before modern medical treatment, hemophilia was essentially a death sentence, delivered through 1,000 small cuts. The royal hemophilia story begins with Queen Victoria of Britain, who ruled from 1837 to 1901. Victoria herself didn't have hemophilia. The condition almost exclusively affects males, while females are typically carriers who can pass the gene to their children without suffering symptoms themselves. Modern genetic analysis suggests that the mutation arose spontaneously in Victoria's genetic line, possibly in her father, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent, or even in Victoria herself as a new mutation. Victoria's role as the grandmother of Europe made her genetic legacy a continental disaster. She had 9 children who married into royal families across Europe, spreading the hemophilia gene like a biological time bomb. Her strategy of strengthening political alliances through royal marriages inadvertently created a genetic network that would weaken the very dynasties she sought to protect. Leopold, Duke of Albany, was Victoria's first son to manifest the disease. Born in 1853, he suffered from frequent bleeding episodes that left him weak and often bedridden. Victoria's physicians initially didn't understand his condition, attributing his problems to a nervous disposition or moral weakness. The young prince lived in constant fear of injury, unable to participate in normal physical activities or military training expected of royal males. Leopold's life was a series of close calls with death. Minor falls that wouldn't harm normal children left him bleeding internally for days. A simple nosebleed could become a medical emergency. He suffered from painful joint bleeding that caused permanent damage and left him partially disabled. Despite these challenges, Leopold was intellectually gifted and served as an informal advisor to his mother on political matters. The genetic mathematics of hemophilia inheritance are particularly cruel. Carrier mothers have a 50% chance of passing the gene to each child. Sons who inherit the gene will have the disease, while daughters who inherit it become carriers themselves. This pattern means that the condition can skip generations while silently spreading through family lines, only manifesting when the genetic dice roll unluckily. Victoria's daughter Alice married Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, creating the German branch of the hemophilia epidemic. Alice was a carrier, and 2 of her sons inherited the condition. Friedrich, who died at age 3 from brain hemorrhage after a fall, and Ernst Ludwig, who survived to adulthood but lived as a semi-invalid. More significantly, Alice's daughter, Alexandra, would carry the gene to Russia, where it would contribute to the fall of the Romanov dynasty. The Spanish royal family received their genetic burden through Victoria's daughter Beatrice, who married Prince Henry of Battenberg. Their son Leopold inherited hemophilia and died at age 32 from internal bleeding after a minor surgical procedure. More importantly, Beatrice's daughter, Victoria Eugenie, married King Alfonso XIII of Spain, introducing the gene into the Spanish royal line. Alfonso and Victoria Eugenie's first son, Alfonso, inherited hemophilia. The young prince's condition was kept strictly secret from the Spanish public, but court insiders knew that the heir to the throne was gravely ill. He died at age 31 from internal bleeding following a car accident, tragedy that might have been survivable for someone with normal blood clotting. Their second son, Gonzalo, also had hemophilia and died at age 20 from bleeding complications after another car accident. The psychological impact on royal parents watching their hemophiliac children was devastating. These mothers knew they had passed a genetic death sentence to their sons, while fathers struggled with the knowledge that their dynasties hung by the biological thread of their children's survival. Family correspondence from this period reveals the constant anxiety and guilt that consumed these parents. But nowhere was the political impact of hemophilia more dramatic than in Russia. Alexandra Fyodorovna, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, married Tsar Nicholas II in 1894. Their son, Alexei, born in 1904, inherited hemophilia fact that would reshape Russian history and contribute to the fall of the 1,000-year-old Romanov dynasty. Alexei's condition was kept secret from the Russian people, but within the imperial family, it dominated every decision. The young Tsarevich couldn't participate in normal activities. Playing with other children was too dangerous. Military training, a traditional part of royal education, was impossible. He lived in a protective bubble that isolated him from the experiences that would have prepared him to rule. The medical crises were frequent and terrifying. In 1907, when Alexei was 3, he fell and developed internal bleeding in his leg that lasted 4 days. Court physicians were helpless. They could only watch and hope the bleeding would stop naturally. The boy's screams of pain could be heard throughout the palace. Similar episodes occurred regularly, each one potentially fatal. Alexandra's desperate search for help for her son led her to Grigory Rasputin, the notorious mystic who claimed healing powers. Rasputin's influence over the imperial family wasn't based on religious mysticism or political ambition. It was rooted in his apparent ability to help Alexei during bleeding episodes. Whether through hypnosis, calming presence, or sheer coincidence, Rasputin seemed able to ease the boy's suffering when doctors failed. This relationship proved politically catastrophic. The Russian nobility and public saw the imperial family under the influence of a crude peasant mystic, undermining their authority and dignity. They couldn't know that Alexandra's devotion to Rasputin was driven by maternal desperation, not religious delusion. The secrecy surrounding Alexei's condition made the family's behavior appear irrational and dangerous. The hemophilia gene created a cascade of political consequences that extended far beyond medical concerns. Royal families became secretive and isolated, hiding their genetic problems from subjects who expected strong, healthy leaders. The constant fear of injury made these rulers increasingly cautious and withdrawn, unable to project the strength and confidence that monarchy required. Military leadership became particularly problematic. Hemophiliac princes couldn't serve as army officers or lead troops into battle, violating fundamental expectations of royal duty. This created succession crises as healthy heirs died in wars, while genetically compromised heirs survived in protective isolation. The traditional military culture of European nobility was incompatible with the genetic reality of hemophilia. The medical knowledge of the early 20th century made the situation even worse. Doctors understood that hemophilia was hereditary, but had no effective treatments. They recommended rest, careful protection from injury, and prayer advice that was essentially useless for active royal lives. Some treatments, like bleeding or purging, actually made the condition worse by further compromising the patient's health. The social stigma surrounding hemophilia added another layer of complexity. The condition was seen as evidence of genetic weakness or divine punishment, making it politically dangerous to acknowledge publicly. Royal families went to extraordinary lengths to hide hemophiliac members, creating elaborate deceptions that sometimes backfired when the truth emerged. Genetic counseling was non-existent, meaning royal families continued making marriage decisions without understanding the risks they were creating. Victoria's descendants married each other repeatedly, concentrating the hemophilia gene in ever smaller genetic pools. By the early 20th century, some royal children had multiple paths of inheritance for the hemophilia gene, virtually guaranteeing its expression. The outbreak of World War I created additional challenges for hemophiliac royals. National leaders were expected to visit troops, inspect military facilities, and project strength during wartime. Rulers who couldn't perform these duties appeared weak and unfit, undermining public confidence during critical periods. The genetic weakness of royal families became a national security issue. The Russian Revolution of 1917 can be partially attributed to the political consequences of Alexei's hemophilia. The Rasputin scandal damaged the imperial family's reputation beyond repair. Nicholas I's inability to effectively lead during wartime was partly due to his preoccupation with his son's health. The isolation and secretiveness that hemophilia imposed on the family made them appear disconnected from their subjects' suffering. Modern genetic analysis has revealed the full extent of hemophilia's impact on European royalty. DNA studies of royal remains show that the condition affected at least 20 members of European royal families across 4 generations. The genetic bottleneck created by royal intermarriage meant that once the gene entered the system, it was virtually impossible to eliminate without introducing new bloodlines. The treatment revolution that began in the mid-20th century with blood transfusions and clotting factor concentrates came too late for most royal hemophiliacs. By then, the political damage was already done. Monarchies had fallen, dynasties had ended, and the genetic legacy of the royal disease had permanently altered European history. The hemophilia epidemic finally ended when royal families began marrying outside their traditional genetic circles. The introduction of non-royal bloodlines diluted the concentration of harmful genes and broke the cycle of genetic accumulation that had plagued European nobility for centuries. But the damage was already done. An entire political system had been undermined by a single genetic mutation passed down through generations of royal intermarriage. Part 5. The Bourbon Curse. The House of Bourbon ruled France for over 2 centuries, presiding over the nation's rise to European dominance and its eventual revolutionary collapse. But beneath the gilded surface of Versailles lay a genetic catastrophe that would make the Habsburg disasters look restrained. The Bourbon bloodline became so corrupted through generations of strategic inbreeding that by the time of the French Revolution, the royal family was barely functional, physically, mentally, and politically. The Bourbon genetic nightmare began with a political masterstroke that would prove to be a biological disaster. When Henry IV converted to Catholicism in 1593, declaring that Paris is worth a mass, he established the Bourbon dynasty on the French throne. His marriage policies, designed to strengthen political alliances and consolidate power, inadvertently created one of Europe's most genetically compromised royal lines. The mathematical progression of Bourbon inbreeding follows a predictable but horrifying pattern. Each generation married within an increasingly narrow circle of European royalty, concentrating harmful recessive genes while eliminating genetic diversity. By the reign of Louis XVI, the royal family tree looked more like a spiderweb than a branching structure, with the same ancestors appearing multiple times in every lineage. Louis XIII, who ruled from 1610 to 1643, exemplifies the early stages of Bourbon genetic decline. Born to Henry IV and Marie de Medici, he suffered from chronic health problems that mystified court physicians. Modern medical analysis suggests he had Crohn's disease, a genetic condition that causes severe intestinal inflammation. His frequent bloody stools, abdominal pain, and failure to thrive as a child were all classic symptoms. More disturbing were Louis XIII's psychological problems. He displayed obsessive-compulsive behaviors that interfered with his ability to govern effectively. Court records describe elaborate rituals he required before making any decisions, specific prayers that had to be recited in exact order, objects that had to be arranged in precise patterns, and ceremonial procedures that could take hours to complete. If any element was disturbed, he would become violently agitated and refuse to proceed with state business. The king's relationship with his wife, Anne of Austria, reveals another layer of Bourbon genetic problems. Their marriage remained unconsummated for over 20 years, partly due to Louis XIII's apparent sexual dysfunction and psychological aversion to physical intimacy. When they finally produced an heir, Louis XIV, it was considered miraculous by the French court and suspicious by modern historians who note the timing coincided with Anne's suspected affair with Cardinal Mazarin. Louis XIV, the Sun King, appeared to break the pattern of Bourbon genetic decline through sheer force of personality and political genius. However, closer examination reveals that he simply hid his problems more effectively than his predecessors. Medical records show he suffered from chronic digestive issues, frequent fevers, and what court physicians described as nervous complaints that modern doctors would recognize as anxiety disorders. The Sun King's famous control over every aspect of court life wasn't just political theater, it was psychological necessity. His obsessive need to regulate and oversee every detail of Versailles reflected underlying compulsive behaviors that he channeled into statecraft. The elaborate etiquette of the French court served partly to mask the king's mental rigidity and need for predictable routine. Louis XIV's marriage to Maria Theresa of Spain represents a crucial moment in Bourbon genetic concentration. Maria Theresa was his double first cousin. Their mothers were sisters, and their fathers were brothers. This marriage united two of Europe's most inbred royal lines, creating genetic combinations that had never existed before. Their children carried genetic loads that would have been impossible in normal populations. The couple's reproductive history tells a story of genetic devastation hidden behind official celebration. Of their 6 children, only one survived to adulthood. The others died from various ailments that modern medicine recognizes as genetic disorders, immune deficiencies, developmental abnormalities, and metabolic problems that made survival impossible in the 17th century. Louis, the Grand Dauphin, their surviving son, displayed classic signs of intellectual disability combined with behavioral problems that made him unfit to rule. Court observers noted his inability to concentrate on complex issues, his childlike emotional responses to adult situations, and his disturbing fascination with violence and death. When he died in 1711, many courtiers privately expressed relief that he would never become king. The succession then passed to Louis XIV's great-grandson, who became Louis XV at age 5. The young king's minority revealed the full extent of Bourbon genetic problems. His regents struggled to hide his developmental delays, speech impediments, and learning disabilities from the French public. Educational records show that he couldn't read properly until age 12 and never mastered basic mathematical concepts throughout his life. Louis XV's adult reign was marked by increasing incompetence that reflected his genetic limitations. He made disastrous military decisions during the 7 Years' War, partly because he couldn't understand complex strategic concepts. His financial policies were erratic and contradictory, reflecting cognitive problems that made consistent reasoning impossible. The famous quote attributed to him, "After me, The deluge wasn't cynical indifference, but recognition of his own inability to solve France's problems. The king's personal life revealed additional genetic problems. Despite having multiple mistresses, including the famous Madame de Pompadour, Louis XV struggled with sexual dysfunction and emotional instability. Court physicians prescribed various treatments for what they described as melancholy and nervous weakness, conditions that modern psychiatrists would diagnose as major depression combined with anxiety disorders. His marriage to Marie Lecziska produced 10 children, but their survival rate was significantly lower than normal for royal families with access to the best medical care available. Several children died in infancy from mysterious ailments, while others displayed obvious developmental problems that were carefully hidden from public view. The genetic concentration reached its peak with Louis XVI, whose parents were second cousins through multiple lineages. Modern genetic analysis shows that his coefficient of inbreeding was higher than many Habsburg rulers, making him one of the most genetically compromised monarchs in European history. His famous inability to consummate his marriage with Marie Antoinette for 7 years wasn't just psychological, it reflected physical abnormalities that required surgical correction. Louis XVI's medical records, preserved in the French National Archives, reveal extensive genetic problems. He suffered from phimosis, a condition where the foreskin cannot be retracted, making sexual intercourse extremely painful or impossible. When French physicians finally performed the necessary surgery in 1777, they discovered additional anatomical abnormalities that had never been publicly acknowledged. More significantly, Louis XVI displayed clear signs of what modern medicine would recognize as autism spectrum disorder. His obsessive interest in locksmithing and mechanical devices, his inability to read social cues in political situations, his rigid adherence to routine, and his emotional meltdowns when faced with unexpected changes all suggest neurological differences rooted in his genetic heritage. The king's political incompetence during the French Revolution reflected genuine cognitive limitations rather than simple bad judgment. He couldn't understand the complex economic and social forces that were destroying his kingdom. His responses to crisis were often inappropriate or ineffective because he lacked the mental flexibility to adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. Marie Antoinette's frustrations with her husband become more understandable when viewed through the lens of his genetic problems. Letters between the royal couple reveal her growing awareness that Louis XVI was fundamentally incapable of providing effective leadership. Her famous extravagance and political meddling partly reflected her attempts to compensate for her husband's inadequacies. The Bourbon genetic legacy extended beyond the immediate royal family to affect the entire French political system. Nobles who served at Versailles were required to marry within approved bloodlines, creating an aristocratic class that was almost as genetically compromised as the royal family itself. This genetic bottleneck among the ruling class meant that France's political leadership became increasingly dysfunctional just when the nation faced its greatest challenges. Court physicians were well aware of the Bourbon genetic problems, but were powerless to address them. Medical records from the 18th century describe recurring family ailments and inherited weaknesses that affected royal children generation after generation. Some doctors recommended marriages outside the traditional noble bloodlines, but these suggestions were rejected for political reasons. The treatment methods employed by royal physicians often made genetic conditions worse, bleeding, purging, and mercury treatments were standard responses to the chronic health problems that plagued Bourbon rulers. These harsh remedies weakened already compromised immune systems and worsened genetic conditions that required supportive care rather than aggressive intervention. Religious interpretations of Bourbon genetic problems created additional complications. When kings claimed divine right to rule, their obvious physical and mental defects became theological challenges. How could God's anointed representatives be so obviously flawed? Various explanations emerged, from divine testing to spiritual corruption, but none addressed the underlying genetic causes. The economic consequences of Bourbon genetic decline were staggering. As rulers became less capable of governing effectively, France's financial systems deteriorated. The complex economic reforms needed to address the nation's fiscal crisis required intellectual capabilities that genetically compromised kings simply didn't possess. The famous financial chaos that precipitated the French Revolution partly reflected the cognitive limitations of rulers who couldn't understand their own kingdom's economic systems. The pattern of genetic decline accelerated in the final decades of Bourbon rule. Louis XVI's brothers, the Counts of Provence and Artois, both displayed significant genetic problems, including fertility issues, mental instability, and physical deformities. The royal family's gene pool had become so restricted that normal reproduction was becoming impossible. Court records reveal elaborate deceptions designed to hide the royal family's genetic problems from the French public. Official portraits were painted to minimize physical deformities. Medical bulletins were falsified to suggest better health than actually existed. Diplomatic protocols were designed to prevent foreign observers from spending extended time with genetically compromised royals. The genetic concentration of harmful traits reached such levels that spontaneous miscarriages became common among Bourbon women. Marie Antoinette suffered multiple pregnancy losses that were officially attributed to accidents or illnesses, but likely reflected genetic incompatibilities that made normal fetal development impossible. The intellectual limitations of genetically compromised Bourbon rulers made them particularly vulnerable to manipulation by court advisors and foreign influences. Their inability to understand complex political situations made them dependent on advisors who often had their own agendas. This created a shadow government of nobles and bureaucrats who wielded real power while maintaining the fiction of royal authority. The French Revolution represented more than political upheaval. It was biological house cleaning. The execution of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette eliminated a genetically unsustainable bloodline that had become incapable of effective governance. The revolutionary ideology of equality wasn't just political philosophy, it was biological necessity, recognizing that centuries of genetic concentration had made traditional hereditary rule impossible. The surviving Bourbon lines that returned to power after Napoleon's defeat were biologically different from their predecessors. The emigrants who fled France during the Revolution had married outside traditional bloodlines by necessity, introducing genetic diversity that their ancestors had systematically eliminated. The restored Bourbon monarchy was literally a different genetic entity than the one that had been overthrown. Modern genetic analysis of Bourbon remains reveals the full extent of the dynasty's biological catastrophe. DNA studies show genetic diversity levels lower than many isolated populations, with harmful recessive traits concentrated to unprecedented levels. The miracle isn't that the Bourbon dynasty fell, It's that it lasted as long as it did, given the genetic burden its rulers carried. The Bourbon curse demonstrates how political strategies can have unintended biological consequences that ultimately destroy the very systems they were designed to protect. The dynasty's obsession with bloodline purity created genetic purity that made effective rule impossible. Their revolution wasn't just political, it was evolutionary, eliminating a bloodline that had become incompatible with survival in the modern world. Part 6. Incest in Ancient Dynasties Beyond Europe. The obsession with pure blood wasn't born in the palaces of Europe. Long before the Habsburgs ever dreamed of their twisted family trees, ancient civilizations had already perfected the art of keeping power locked within bloodlines, and the results were just as horrifying. Picture ancient Egypt, land of the pharaohs, where gods walked among mortals. But these weren't just any gods. They were brother husbands and sister wives, locked in an eternal dance of divine incest that would make even the most depraved European noble blush. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, from 305 BCE to 30 BCE, founded by Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals. This Greek family took Egyptian customs and twisted them into something far more sinister. They didn't just adopt the pharaonic tradition of sibling marriage, they perfected it. For 15 generations, the Ptolemies married brother to sister, uncle to niece, and in some cases, fathers to daughters. They created a family tree that looked more like a telephone pole, with each generation growing more genetically compromised than the last. The math is staggering. By the time Cleopatra VII was born, she had only 6 different ancestors in her family tree going back 5 generations, when she should have had 32. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. The Ptolemies weren't content with simple sibling marriages. Ptolemy II married his full sister Arsinoe too, and declared her a goddess. Their union produced no surviving children, perhaps nature's way of rejecting such genetic abomination. Ptolemy VIII married his sister Cleopatra II, then later married her daughter Cleopatra III, making him both uncle and stepfather to his second wife. The famous Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, was the product of at least 12 generations of incest. Her parents were siblings, her grandparents were siblings, her great-grandparents were siblings. The genetic coefficient of inbreeding in her bloodline was higher than that of laboratory mice bred, specifically for genetic uniformity. Yet somehow, Cleopatra VII defied the odds. Historical accounts describe her as intelligent, charismatic, and capable of speaking 9 languages. But she was also the last of her line, and when she died, she took with her the final gasps of a dynasty that had literally bred itself into extinction. The genetic damage wasn't just theoretical. Earlier Ptolemies suffered from obesity, mental instability, and physical deformities. Ptolemy IV was described as effeminate and weak, prone to violent rages and paranoid delusions. He murdered his mother, his brother, and his uncle in fits of madness that may have been caused by generations of genetic decay. But Egypt wasn't alone in its genetic nightmare. Half a world away, the Inca Empire was conducting its own experiment in royal inbreeding. The Sapa Inca, considered the direct descendant of the sun god Inti, was required to marry his sister to maintain the purity of divine blood. This wasn't just tradition, it was religious law. The most famous example was Huayna Capac, the last great Sapa Inca before the Spanish conquest. He married his sister Coya, Mama Roa Aclo, and their son Huascar, was groomed to inherit the empire. But genetic weakening may have played a role in the empire's rapid collapse. When Spanish conquistadors arrived, they found an empire already weakened by civil war between Huascar and his half-brother, Atahualpa, sons of the same inbred father but different mothers. The Hawaiian royal family provides another chilling example. The alii, or Hawaiian nobility, practiced brother-sister marriage to maintain their mana, or spiritual power. The highest-ranking chiefs were expected to marry their sisters to produce the most sacred offspring, called Niapio. These children, born of the closest possible blood relation, were considered so sacred they couldn't even let their shadows touch commoners. King Kamehameha III married his sister, Nahanina, in a ceremony that scandalized Christian missionaries, but was considered essential by Hawaiian religious leaders. Their child died in infancy, possibly due to genetic complications. Nahianina herself died young, described by witnesses as increasingly unstable and prone to violent outbursts. The genetic consequences of these practices weren't limited to individual families. Entire royal bloodlines developed characteristic deformities and mental conditions. In ancient Persia, the Sassanid dynasty practiced extensive royal intermarriage, leading to a documented increase in congenital blindness, deafness, and mental disabilities among the ruling class. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the kingdom of Kush in what is now Sudan. Kushite royals not only married siblings, but sometimes practiced polygamous incest, where kings would marry multiple sisters or daughters simultaneously. Archaeological evidence from royal tombs suggests high infant mortality rates and physical deformities that became more pronounced with each generation. These practices weren't anomalies or cultural quirks. They were systematic attempts to concentrate power and maintain divine authority through genetic isolation. But they all led to the same inevitable conclusion. When bloodlines become too pure, they become poison. The ancient world was littered with fallen dynasties, each one a testament to the genetic price of absolute power. From the inbred pharaohs of Egypt to the sacred alii of Hawaii, the message was clear. Divine blood has a way of becoming cursed blood, and curses have a way of destroying the very empires they were meant to protect. Part 7. The Austro-Hungarian Decline. June 28, 1914. A single gunshot in Sarajevo changed the world forever. But what if I told you that the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand wasn't just about politics or nationalism? What if the real story was written in his blood, in the genetic decay that had been eating away at the Austro-Hungarian Empire from within 4 centuries? The Habsburg dynasty that ruled Austria-Hungary wasn't just politically fragmented, it was biologically compromised. And by the time the first shots of World War I were fired, the empire's ruling class was so genetically weakened that they couldn't have held the realm together, even if Franz Ferdinand had lived. Let's start with Franz Ferdinand himself. Born in 1863, he was the product of generations of Habsburg inbreeding, though his line was somewhat less compromised than the Spanish branch we discussed earlier. His father, Archduke Karl Ludwig, was the brother of Emperor Franz Joseph I. His mother, Princess Maria Annunziata of Bourbon II Sicilies, brought her own baggage of royal intermarriage from the Italian peninsula. But Franz Ferdinand was actually one of the healthier Habsburgs of his generation, which tells you everything you need to know about the state of the dynasty. He suffered from tuberculosis, a disease that ravaged his lungs and left him frequently bedridden. His contemporaries described him as moody, prone to violent outbursts, and obsessed with hunting, to an almost pathological degree. He once killed 2,140 animals in a single day, a massacre that shocked even his fellow aristocrats. More telling was his choice of wife. Franz Ferdinand shocked the Habsburg court by marrying Sophie Chotek, a Czech countess who was considered far beneath his station. This wasn't a love story. It was an act of genetic rebellion. Sophie's bloodline was relatively fresh, untainted by the centuries of royal intermarriage that had produced the Habsburg jaw and the Habsburg madness. The marriage was considered so scandalous that it was declared morganatic, meaning their children could never inherit the throne. The Habsburg court was so obsessed with blood purity that they preferred genetic decay to genetic health. They would rather see the dynasty die than allow fresh blood to save it. And the dynasty was dying. Emperor Franz Joseph I, Franz Ferdinand's uncle, was himself the product of extensive inbreeding. His parents were first cousins, and his family tree resembled the same twisted knot we've seen in other royal lines. Franz Joseph ruled for 68 years, but his reign was marked by constant crisis, military defeats, and the gradual disintegration of the multi-ethnic empire. The genetic problems weren't limited to the main imperial line. Throughout the Austro-Hungarian nobility, centuries of intermarriage had produced a ruling class that was increasingly isolated from reality. Count Berchtold, the foreign minister who pushed for war after Franz Ferdinand's assassination, came from a family notorious for its eccentricity and poor judgment. Prince Metternich, one of the empire's leading diplomats, was described by contemporaries as brilliant but unstable, prone to megalomaniacal fantasies. But the real genetic time bomb was Crown Prince Rudolf, Franz Joseph's son and heir, until his mysterious death in 1889. Rudolf was the product of a marriage between first cousins, and he displayed all the classic signs of Habsburg degeneration. He was mentally unstable, sexually promiscuous, and addicted to morphine. His liberal political views put him at odds with his conservative father, but his real problem was biological. Rudolf's death at the hunting lodge of Mayerling remains one of history's great mysteries. The official story claimed it was suicide, but witnesses described a man in the grip of severe mental illness, possibly bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. Some historians suggest he was poisoned, but the symptoms match those of genetic disorders common in highly inbred populations. Rudolf's death changed the line of succession, making Franz Ferdinand the heir, but it also revealed the fundamental weakness of the Habsburg system. The empire was being ruled by men whose judgment was compromised by centuries of genetic damage. They made decisions not based on political reality, but on the distorted perceptions of minds shaped by inbreeding. The military leadership was no better. General Konrad von Hetzendorf, the chief of staff who eagerly pushed for war, came from minor Austrian nobility with its own history of intermarriage. He was obsessed with the idea of a preventive war against Serbia, a fixation that bordered on the pathological. His strategic thinking was muddled, his grasp of modern warfare minimal. When war finally came, the genetic weakness of the Austro-Hungarian leadership became apparent immediately. The empire's armies were poorly equipped, badly led, and commanded by officers who seemed incapable of adapting to modern warfare. Within months, Austrian forces were in retreat on multiple fronts. The Battle of Galicia in 1914 was a disaster that cost Austria-Hungary 400,000 casualties in just 5 weeks. The Battle of the Isonzo, fought 11 times between 1915 and 1917, became a meat grinder that consumed an entire generation of Austrian and Italian youth. Each defeat weakened not just the empire's military position, but its political stability. Emperor Franz Joseph, now in his 80s, struggled to hold the empire together. But age had only magnified the genetic and psychological problems that had plagued his family for generations. He became increasingly isolated, making decisions based on outdated information and romantic notions of imperial glory that bore no relation to military reality. The ethnic minorities within the empire, the Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, and South Slavs, began to see independence not just as politically desirable, but as biologically necessary. They were literally trying to escape from the genetic dead end that the Habsburg dynasty represented. By 1918, the empire was collapsing, not just from military defeat, but from internal dissolution. The November Revolution that ended Habsburg rule wasn't just a political uprising. It was an immune response, the body politic rejecting a leadership class that had become genetically and mentally incapable of governing. Franz Ferdinand's assassination hadn't just triggered a war. It had exposed the fundamental weakness of a system based on genetic purity rather than genetic health. The Austro-Hungarian Empire died not because of Serbian nationalism or German militarism, but because it had bred itself into incompetence. The last Habsburg emperor, Karl I, abdicated in 1918 after ruling for just 2 years. He was young, relatively healthy, and desperately wanted to save his empire. But he was also the product of the same genetic narrowing that had doomed his predecessors. His attempts at peace negotiations were fumbling and ineffective, his political judgment poor. The Habsburg dynasty had ruled Central Europe for over 6 centuries. But in the end, they were defeated not by external enemies, but by the poison in their own veins. The blood that had once bound the empire together had become the curse that tore it apart. Part 8. The royals who tried to break the chain. Not all royals were content to be prisoners of their own bloodlines. Throughout history, there were rebels, reformers, and romantics who dared to challenge the genetic orthodoxy that had trapped their families for centuries. Their stories are tales of courage, scandal, and often tragedy, as they discovered that breaking free from centuries of inbreeding was easier said than done. Let's start with one of the most famous royal rebels, King Edward VIII of Britain, later the Duke of Windsor. In 1936, he shocked the world by abdicating the throne to Mary Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. The official story focused on her marital status and nationality, but there was another factor at play. Edward was breaking centuries of royal inbreeding tradition by choosing a wife from completely outside the European royal gene pool. Edward's decision wasn't just romantic, it was biologically revolutionary. Wallis Simpson brought no royal blood, no inherited genetic defects, no family history of hemophilia or porphyria. She represented genetic salvation for the British royal line, fresh DNA that could have helped repair centuries of accumulated damage. But the British establishment couldn't tolerate such genetic heresy. The Church of England, Parliament, and the royal court all conspired to force Edward from the throne. They preferred his brother, George VI, who dutifully married Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, a member of the Scottish nobility with her own connections to the royal gene pool. The tragedy is that Edward's instincts were correct. His niece, the future Queen Elizabeth II, would later marry her third cousin, Prince Philip, continuing the cycle of royal intermarriage. Their son Charles would marry Diana Spencer, a distant cousin, with her own royal connections. The pattern continued. The genetic circle remained closed. But Edward wasn't the first royal to recognize the danger of inbreeding. In 18th century Russia, Catherine the Great faced a similar dilemma. Born Sophie Friederich August von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornberg, she was a German princess who married into the Russian royal family. But unlike most royal consorts, Catherine had no intention of perpetuating the genetic mistakes of her predecessors. Catherine's husband, Peter III, was the product of extensive royal intermarriage and showed clear signs of mental instability. He was childish, cruel, and possibly mentally disabled. Catherine realized that producing children with Peter would only continue the cycle of genetic decay that had already weakened the Russian throne. Her solution was radical. Catherine almost certainly had affairs with healthier men and passed their children off as legitimate heirs. Her son Paul I bore little physical resemblance to Peter III, but looked remarkably similar to Sergei Saltykov, one of Catherine's known lovers. Catherine was essentially conducting a covert eugenics program, introducing fresh genetic material into the royal bloodline without admitting what she was doing. The strategy worked, at least temporarily. Paul I, despite his controversial parentage, was more mentally stable than his supposed father. His son Alexander I became one of Russia's greatest rulers, the man who defeated Napoleon and reshaped Europe. The genetic infusion may have saved the Romanov dynasty for another century. In Spain, Queen Isabella II faced similar challenges. The Spanish Bourbon dynasty had become so inbred that her father, Ferdinand VII, suffered from severe physical and mental disabilities. Isabella recognized that continuing the pattern of cousin marriages would destroy her family line entirely. Her solution was scandalous by royal standards. Isabella took numerous lovers from outside the nobility, including army officers, musicians, and even servants. Her official husband, her cousin Francisco de, was widely believed to be homosexual and incapable of fathering children. Most of Isabella's children were probably illegitimate, the offspring of her affairs with genetically healthier men. The Spanish court was horrified, but Isabella's strategy may have saved the dynasty. Her son Alfonso XII was intelligent, capable, and physically robust. His reign marked a period of relative stability for Spain, a dramatic improvement over the chaos and incompetence of previous Bourbon rulers. Perhaps the most systematic attempt to break the inbreeding cycle came from an unexpected source: Napoleon Bonaparte. Though not born royal, Napoleon married into the Austrian royal family when he wed Marie-Louise, daughter of Emperor Francis I. But Napoleon had studied the genetic disasters of European royalty and was determined not to repeat their mistakes. Napoleon's first wife, Josephine de Beauharnais, brought no royal blood to their union. When that marriage proved childless, Napoleon's second choice was calculated. Marie-Louise was Habsburg royalty, but Napoleon ensured their son, Napoleon II, would have access to genetic diversity. He planned marriages for the boy with non-royal partners and encouraged his relatives to marry outside traditional royal circles. The Napoleonic system might have revolutionized European royalty, but the emperor's defeat at Waterloo ended the experiment. Napoleon II died young, possibly from tuberculosis inherited from his Habsburg mother, and the old system of royal intermarriage resumed. Some royal rebels paid a terrible price for their genetic rebellion. In Bavaria, King Ludwig II chose never to marry at all, rather than perpetuate his family's genetic problems. Ludwig came from a line of Wittelsbach rulers notorious for mental instability. His grandfather Ludwig I was forced to abdicate after a scandalous affair. His father Maximilian II was prone to violent mood swings, and Ludwig himself showed increasing signs of mental illness as he aged. Ludwig's solution was radical abstinence. He built fantastical castles, patronized Richard Wagner, and lived in a world of romantic fantasy. But he refused to produce heirs who might inherit his family's genetic curse. His death in 1886, officially by drowning, but possibly by suicide, ended the direct line of the Bavarian Wittelsbachs. In Portugal, King Carlos I attempted a different approach. Recognizing that his family's genetic problems were becoming politically dangerous, he tried to modernize the monarchy and reduce its dependence on hereditary succession. Carlos promoted constitutional reforms and encouraged merit-based appointments to government positions. But Carlos's reforms came too late. The Portuguese royal family had become so identified with genetic decay and political incompetence that Republicans used their physical and mental disabilities as propaganda tools. Carlos and his eldest son were assassinated in 1908, and the monarchy fell 2 years later. The most successful genetic rebels may have been the Scandinavian royals. In Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, royal families began systematically marrying outside the traditional European royal gene pool in the early 20th century. They chose partners from the minor nobility, the wealthy bourgeoisie, and even commoners. The results were dramatic. Scandinavian royals of the modern era are notably healthier, more intelligent, and more politically stable than their predecessors. They've avoided the genetic diseases that plagued other royal families and have successfully adapted to constitutional monarchy in the modern world. Crown Princess Victoria of Sweden married her personal trainer, Daniel. Crown Prince Haakon of Norway married a single mother with a troubled past, Mette-Marit. But they represent the ultimate victory over centuries of genetic orthodoxy. The genetic rebels of royal history were fighting not just for love or personal happiness, but for the biological survival of their dynasties. They understood, often intuitively, that genetic diversity was more valuable than genetic purity. Their victories and defeats shaped the modern world, determining which royal families survived and which ones vanished into history. Part 9. Modern royal families and genetic damage. You might think the age of royal inbreeding is behind us, buried in history books and museum portraits. You'd be wrong. Modern DNA analysis has revealed that the genetic ghosts of centuries past still haunt today's royal families, hiding behind designer clothes and public relations campaigns. In 2009, scientists analyzed DNA from King Tutankhamun's mummy and made a shocking discovery. The boy pharaoh, who died at just 19, was so severely inbred that he suffered from multiple genetic disorders: a cleft palate, a clubfoot, and possibly temporal lobe epilepsy. His parents were brother and sister, and his grandparents were also siblings. The genetic coefficient of inbreeding was 0.25, equivalent to the offspring of full siblings. But here's what's truly disturbing. When geneticists compared Tutankhamun's DNA profile to modern populations, they found similar levels of genetic homozygosity in some contemporary royal families. The blood of pharaohs still flows in the veins of today's monarchs, and it carries the same genetic burdens. The British royal family provides the most extensively studied example. In 2011, researchers analyzed the mitochondrial DNA of several royal remains and traced genetic patterns through multiple generations. What they found was alarming. Despite attempts to diversify the gene pool through marriages to commoners like Kate Middleton and Meghan Markle, the core royal bloodline remains highly inbred. Prince William and Kate Middleton are actually distant cousins, sharing a common ancestor in Sir Thomas Layton, who died in 1610. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's marriage represented a more significant genetic departure, introducing African and European American DNA into the royal line. Their son Archie has the most genetically diverse royal bloodline in centuries, but the damage from previous generations remains visible. The Windsor family continues to display physical characteristics associated with centuries of inbreeding. The prominent nose, the distinctive jawline, the tendency toward baldness in male members. These aren't just family traits, they're genetic signatures of a closed breeding population. More concerning are the hidden genetic burdens. Hemophilia, the royal disease that we discussed earlier, was never completely eliminated from European royal bloodlines. Genetic testing has revealed that several contemporary royals carry the recessive gene for hemophilia, meaning their children could potentially inherit the bleeding disorder. The Spanish royal family provides an even more dramatic example. King Juan Carlos I, who ruled from 1975 to 2014, was the product of multiple generations of Bourbon inbreeding. His family tree resembles a twisted knot, with the same names appearing repeatedly across different branches. Juan Carlos suffered from numerous health problems throughout his life, including hip disorders that required multiple surgeries. His son, King Felipe VI, married Leticia Ortiz, a commoner and former journalist. This marriage was hailed as modernizing the monarchy, but genetic analysis tells a different story. Leticia's bloodline, while not royal, contains its own patterns of regional inbreeding common in rural Spain. Their daughters, Princess Leonor and Infanta Sofia, still carry genetic burdens from both sides of their family tree. The most genetically compromised modern royal family may be the Grimaldis of Monaco. Prince Albert II is the son of Prince Rainier III and Princess Grace Kelly. While Grace Kelly brought American genes into the family, Prince Rainier's lineage was heavily inbred. The Grimaldi family tree shows extensive intermarriage with other European noble families over several centuries. Prince Albert's children face particular genetic challenges. His son Jacques and daughter Gabriella are twins born to Princess Charlene, a former South African Olympic swimmer. While Charlene's background provides genetic diversity, the Grimaldi genetic legacy includes a predisposition to certain cancers, heart conditions, and neurological disorders. Perhaps most disturbing is what genetic testing has revealed about intelligence and mental health in royal families. Several studies have suggested that centuries of inbreeding may have reduced average IQ levels in some royal bloodlines. The divine right to rule may have been undermined by the biological right to cognitive function. The Swedish royal family has been more successful in avoiding genetic problems through strategic marriages. King Carl XVI, Gustav, married Sylvia Sommerleth, a German-Brazilian commoner with no royal blood. Their children, Crown Princess Victoria, Prince Carl Philip, and Princess Madeline, all married outside traditional royal circles. Crown Princess Victoria's marriage to her personal trainer, Daniel, caused a scandal in traditional royal circles. But geneticists applauded the decision. Daniel's working-class Swedish background introduced completely fresh genetic material into the royal line. Their daughter, Princess Estelle, has one of the most genetically diverse royal bloodlines in European history. The Norwegian royal family has followed a similar pattern. King Harald V married Sonja Haraldson, a commoner from a middle-class Norwegian family. Their son, Crown Prince Haakon, created even more controversy by marrying Mette-Marit Jessem Heiby, a single mother with a troubled past. But from a genetic perspective, these marriages represent salvation. Mette-Marit's background, while controversial, brought genetic diversity that the Norwegian royal family desperately needed. Her son, from a previous relationship, Marius Borg Heiby, and her children with Haakon, Princess Ingrid Alexandra, and Prince Suver Magnus, represent a new generation of royals with healthier genetic profiles. Modern genetic testing has also revealed hidden connections between seemingly unrelated royal families. The European royal families are so interconnected that they essentially form a single extended family. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip were third cousins. King Philippe VI of Spain and Queen Letizia are related through multiple ancestral lines. Even the seemingly diverse marriages of recent decades often involve distant cousins. The most shocking revelation comes from mitochondrial DNA analysis. All European royal families can trace their maternal lineages back to a small number of women who lived in the medieval period. This means that genetic diversity in royal bloodlines is far more limited than previously understood. Some royal families have begun to acknowledge these genetic realities. The Dutch royal family has been particularly proactive, encouraging marriages outside traditional royal circles and even commissioning genetic studies to identify potential health risks. Queen Maxima of the Netherlands, born in Argentina, represents a radical departure from traditional European royal genetics. But other royal families remain in denial. Despite overwhelming genetic evidence, some monarchies continue to promote the myth of noble blood and genetic superiority. They refuse genetic testing, suppress medical records, and maintain the fiction that royal bloodlines are somehow superior to common genetic heritage. The truth is more complex and more disturbing. Modern royal families are living museums of genetic history, carrying in their DNA the accumulated damage of centuries of inbreeding. They are both victims and perpetrators of a system that valued genetic purity over genetic health. Advanced genetic testing now allows scientists to predict with increasing accuracy which genetic disorders royal children might inherit. Some royal families have begun using this information to make reproductive decisions, essentially practicing a modern form of eugenics to eliminate harmful genetic traits. The ethical implications are staggering. Should royal families be required to undergo genetic screening before marriage? Should genetic disorders disqualify someone from inheriting a throne? Should taxpayers fund genetic therapy for royal families whose problems are the result of centuries of deliberate inbreeding? These aren't theoretical questions. As genetic testing becomes more sophisticated and less expensive, the genetic secrets of royal families are becoming harder to hide. The blood that once symbolized divine right is being revealed as profoundly, tragically human. Part 10. The lasting legacy of royal inbreeding. We've traveled through centuries of genetic catastrophe, witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, and seen how the pursuit of pure blood led to poisoned bloodlines. But what does it all mean? What lessons does this dark history teach us about power, genetics, and human nature itself? The legacy of royal inbreeding extends far beyond the palaces and portraits of dead monarchs. It shaped the modern world in ways we're only beginning to understand, influencing everything from democratic revolutions to contemporary attitudes about genetics, race, and heredity. Let's start with the most obvious legacy, the fall of monarchies themselves. The genetic decay of royal families didn't just weaken individual rulers. It undermined the entire philosophical foundation of hereditary monarchy. How could kings claim divine right to rule when their bloodlines produced madness, deformity, and incompetence? The French Revolution of 1789 wasn't just about economic inequality or political oppression. It was also a rejection of the genetic elite that had ruled France for centuries. Revolutionary pamphlets regularly mocked the physical deformities and mental disabilities of the royal family. Marie Antoinette's alleged promiscuity wasn't just political scandal. It was a biological rebellion against a system that demanded genetic purity. The revolutionaries understood, perhaps intuitively, that centuries of royal inbreeding had created a ruling class that was literally unfit to govern. When they sent Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette to the guillotine, they weren't just executing individuals. They were killing the idea that genetic inheritance could determine political fitness. Similar patterns played out across Europe throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. The 1848 revolutions, the unification of Germany and Italy, the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. All of these political transformations were facilitated by the genetic weakness of the ruling dynasties. The most dramatic example was the Russian Revolution of 1917. The Romanov dynasty had been weakened by centuries of intermarriage, and Tsar Nicholas II was arguably one of the most genetically compromised rulers in European history. His son, Alexei's hemophilia, became a symbol of royal decay, and the family's relationship with the mystic Rasputin, brought in to treat the boy's condition, scandalized the Russian people. When revolutionaries executed the entire Romanov family in 1918, they were eliminating not just political opponents, but genetic liabilities. The Bolsheviks understood that allowing any Romanov to survive would mean risking the restoration of a bloodline that had already proven its biological unfitness to rule. But the legacy of royal inbreeding extends beyond the political realm into the very foundations of modern genetics. The study of hereditary diseases in royal families provided some of the earliest scientific evidence for Mendelian inheritance patterns. Hemophilia in the descendants of Queen Victoria, porphyria in the House of Hanover, the Habsburg jaw. These weren't just royal peculiarities. They were genetic case studies that helped establish the science of heredity. Ironically, the royal families that had tried so hard to keep their blood pure became the laboratory specimens that proved the dangers of inbreeding. Modern genetic counseling, population genetics, and our understanding of recessive genetic disorders all owe a debt to the unwitting contributions of Europe's royal families. The psychological legacy is equally profound. Royal inbreeding created a template for understanding how isolated elites can become detached from reality. The madness of King George III, the paranoia of Tsar Nicholas II, the bizarre behavior of Ludwig II of Bavaria. These weren't just individual psychological problems. They were the predictable results of genetic isolation combined with absolute power. This understanding has influenced modern theories about political leadership and institutional design. Democratic systems with term limits, checks and balances, and regular elections aren't just political innovations. They're biological safeguards against the kind of genetic and psychological decay that destroyed hereditary monarchies. The civil rights movements of the 20th century also drew lessons from royal inbreeding. If centuries of pure royal blood had produced weakness, madness, and incompetence, what did that say about racial purity theories promoted by fascists and segregationists? The genetic disasters of European royalty became powerful arguments against racial supremacist ideologies. Scientists studying royal genetics helped debunk the myth of genetic superiority based on ancestry or ethnicity. If the purest bloodlines in human history had produced such catastrophic results, then genetic diversity, not genetic purity, must be the key to human health and intelligence. Modern genetic research has validated these insights. Studies of isolated populations, from the Amish of Pennsylvania to the inhabitants of remote islands, consistently show that genetic isolation leads to increased rates of genetic disorders, reduced fertility, and decreased cognitive function. The royal families of Europe were simply the most extreme and well-documented examples of this biological principle. The legacy also extends into contemporary debates about genetic engineering and designer babies. As we develop the technology to edit human genes and select genetic traits, the history of royal inbreeding serves as a cautionary tale. The pursuit of genetic perfection through artificial selection can lead to dangerous genetic bottlenecks and unexpected consequences. Royal families thought they were improving their bloodlines by concentrating noble genes. Instead, they concentrated genetic defects and created biological time bombs that destroyed their dynasties. Modern genetic engineers would do well to remember this lesson as they contemplate the power to reshape human genetics. The economic legacy is also significant. The genetic decay of royal families contributed to political instability, which in turn disrupted economic development. Countries ruled by genetically compromised monarchs experienced more frequent wars, revolutions, and succession crises. The economic cost of royal inbreeding can be measured in lost productivity, destroyed infrastructure, and wasted human capital. Conversely, countries that moved away from hereditary monarchy toward more meritocratic systems of government often experienced rapid economic growth. The correlation between political modernization and economic development may be partially explained by the elimination of genetically compromised ruling elites. Perhaps most importantly, the history of royal inbreeding teaches us about the dangers of closed systems. Whether we're talking about genetics, politics, economics, or ideas, isolation and inbreeding lead to weakness and eventual collapse. Diversity, whether genetic or intellectual, is not just morally preferable, it's biologically necessary for long-term survival. This lesson extends beyond royal families to contemporary elites, corporate dynasties, political families, and intellectual establishments that become too insular and self-referential risk the same kind of decay that destroyed European monarchies. The antidote is always the same: fresh blood, new ideas, and genetic or intellectual diversity. The visual legacy of royal inbreeding surrounds us in museums and galleries around the world. Those portraits of pale, thin-lipped monarchs with prominent jaws and vacant stares aren't just artistic representations. They're genetic documents, evidence of centuries of biological experimentation gone wrong. When we look at a painting of Charles II of Spain or a photograph of the last Russian royal family, we're seeing the end result of humanity's longest-running genetic experiment. These images serve as permanent reminders of what happens when power becomes more important than biology, when tradition becomes more valuable than health. The cultural legacy persists in literature, film, and popular culture. From Gothic novels about cursed aristocratic families to modern horror films about inbred rural communities, the theme of genetic decay through isolation continues to fascinate and terrify audiences. These stories aren't just entertainment, they're cultural memory, society's way of remembering and learning from the genetic disasters of the past. Religious institutions also absorbed lessons from royal inbreeding. The Catholic Church's rules about consanguinity, the prohibition against marriages between close relatives, were strengthened and enforced more rigorously as the genetic consequences of royal intermarriage became apparent. Even divine authority had to bow to biological reality. The feminist legacy is particularly interesting. Many of the strongest opponents of royal inbreeding were royal women who recognized that the system was destroying their children. From Catherine the Great's covert eugenics program to Queen Victoria's anguish over hemophilia in her descendants, royal women often understood the biological costs of genetic purity better than their male counterparts. These women were trapped in a system that reduced them to breeding stock, valued only for their ability to produce male heirs with pure blood. But they also had the most intimate knowledge of what genetic isolation was doing to their families. They watched their children suffer from inherited diseases, witnessed the mental deterioration of their husbands, and saw their dynasties crumbling from within. Some royal women became secret agents of genetic rebellion. They took lovers from outside the royal gene pool, ensured their children had access to healthier genetic material, and quietly worked to modernize marriage customs within their courts. Their rebellion wasn't just personal, it was biological warfare against a system that was literally poisoning their bloodlines. The medical legacy of royal inbreeding continues to influence healthcare today. The genetic diseases first identified in royal families, hemophilia, porphyria, Huntington's disease, and dozens of others, became the foundation for modern genetic medicine. The same royal bloodlines that suffered from these conditions also provided the genetic material necessary to understand and eventually treat them. Modern gene therapy owes a particular debt to royal genetics. The concentrated genetic defects in royal bloodlines made it easier for scientists to identify disease-causing genes and develop targeted treatments. In a bitter irony, the same genetic isolation that destroyed royal dynasties is now helping save lives around the world. The technological legacy extends to genealogical research and DNA testing. The extensive family records kept by royal families, combined with preserved biological materials, have created an unprecedented genetic database. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestridna use reference samples from royal bloodlines to help ordinary people trace their genetic heritage. But perhaps the most important legacy is philosophical. The history of royal inbreeding represents humanity's longest and most expensive lesson in the dangers of genetic hubris. For over 2 millennia, the most powerful people in the world conducted a massive experiment in genetic purity. The results were unambiguous failure. This lesson has profound implications for contemporary debates about genetic enhancement, artificial selection, and human genetic engineering. As we develop the technology to modify human genetics on an unprecedented scale, the history of royal inbreeding serves as a warning about the unintended consequences of genetic manipulation. The royal families thought they understood genetics well enough to improve their bloodlines through selective breeding. They were spectacularly wrong. Modern genetic engineers despite having vastly superior scientific knowledge, should approach genetic modification with similar humility. The evolutionary legacy is equally important. Royal inbreeding represented an attempt to override natural selection, to preserve genetic lineages that nature would have eliminated. The consistent failure of these attempts demonstrates the power and importance of evolutionary processes that humans ignore at their own peril. Natural selection favors genetic diversity, hybrid vigor, and adaptation to changing circumstances. Royal inbreeding promoted genetic uniformity, biological weakness, and resistance to change. The clash between these two forces played out over centuries, and natural selection ultimately won. The democratic legacy of royal inbreeding may be its most lasting contribution to human civilization. The genetic failures of hereditary monarchy helped establish the principle that political fitness should be determined by merit rather than inheritance. Democratic institutions, while imperfect, represent a biological as well as political evolution beyond the failed experiment of royal genetics. Modern democratic leaders may have their flaws, but they don't suffer from centuries of accumulated genetic damage. They don't pass on genetic diseases to their political successors. They don't create dynasties that become progressively more incompetent with each generation. The educational legacy continues in schools and universities around the world. The study of royal inbreeding has become a standard component of genetics education, providing students with dramatic examples of inheritance patterns, genetic disorders, and population genetics. These lessons aren't just academic. They're practical knowledge that helps people make informed decisions about reproduction and family planning. The artistic legacy is visible in everything from Renaissance portraits to contemporary genetic art. Artists have always been fascinated by the physical manifestations of royal inbreeding, the distinctive facial features, body shapes, and expressions that marked genetically compromised bloodlines. These artistic records now serve as valuable scientific documents, providing visual evidence of genetic change over time. Museums around the world house collections of royal artifacts that tell the story of genetic decline, from the increasingly elaborate clothing designed to hide physical deformities to the medical instruments used to treat hereditary diseases. These objects provide tangible evidence of biology's triumph over political power. The linguistic legacy appears in languages around the world. Phrases like blue blood, noble bearing, and royal bearing reflect ancient beliefs about genetic superiority that have been thoroughly debunked by royal genetics. These expressions persist in modern language, but their original meaning has been inverted by historical knowledge. The psychological impact on contemporary royal families cannot be understated. Modern royals live with the knowledge that their bloodlines carry the genetic burdens of centuries of inbreeding. They know that their medical histories are public property, that their genetic fitness is constantly evaluated by scientists and the media. This knowledge has fundamentally changed the nature of modern monarchy. Contemporary royal families can no longer claim genetic superiority or divine appointment. They must justify their existence through public service, cultural contribution, and personal merit rather than bloodline purity. The global legacy extends far beyond Europe to every culture that practiced royal inbreeding, from the pharaohs of Egypt to the emperors of Japan, from the Inca of Peru to the kings of Hawaii. Ruling elites around the world learned the same bitter lesson about the dangers of genetic isolation. These parallel evolutionary experiments in royal genetics provide a natural laboratory for understanding human biology. The consistent results across different cultures, different time periods, and different genetic backgrounds demonstrate universal biological principles that transcend cultural differences. The technological implications for modern artificial intelligence and machine learning are surprisingly relevant. Just as royal bloodlines became increasingly isolated and inbred over time, AI systems can suffer from similar problems when trained on limited datasets or when they become too specialized for narrow tasks. The diversity principle that emerged from studying royal genetics, that hybrid vigor and genetic diversity produce stronger organisms, applies equally to artificial intelligence systems. AI researchers now deliberately introduce diversity and randomness into their systems to prevent the kind of optimization dead ends that destroyed royal bloodlines. The environmental legacy of royal inbreeding includes the impact on wildlife, conservation, and breeding programs. Modern zoo managers and conservationists understand the dangers of genetic bottlenecks, partly because of lessons learned from royal genetics. Breeding programs for endangered species now prioritize genetic diversity over genetic purity. The ethical legacy continues to influence debates about reproductive rights, genetic counseling, and medical privacy. The history of royal inbreeding raises difficult questions about genetic responsibility, family planning, and the rights of genetically compromised individuals to reproduce. These aren't theoretical concerns. As genetic testing becomes more widespread and less expensive, ordinary families face the same kinds of genetic decisions that once confronted only royalty. The history of royal inbreeding provides both cautionary tales and practical guidance for navigating these complex choices. The ultimate legacy of royal inbreeding may be the death of genetic determinism itself. The spectacular failure of the world's most genetically pure bloodlines demonstrates that genetic heritage, no matter how noble, cannot guarantee intelligence, competence, or moral worth. Merit, character, and achievement matter more than ancestry. This lesson extends beyond genetics to broader questions about inequality, privilege, and social justice. If genetic purity couldn't preserve the power of royal families, then what justification exists for other forms of hereditary privilege or discrimination based on ancestry? The blood that was supposed to bind dynasties together ultimately became the poison that destroyed them. The curse wasn't supernatural, it was biological, the inevitable result of treating human genetics as a political tool rather than a biological system with its own rules and requirements. Today, as we stand on the threshold of unprecedented power to manipulate human genetics, the history of royal inbreeding serves as both warning and guide. The pursuit of genetic perfection through artificial selection is as dangerous today as it was in the palaces of medieval Europe. The royal families of the past paid the ultimate price for their genetic hubris, their dynasties, their power, and often their lives. Their sacrifice wasn't intentional, but it provided humanity with invaluable knowledge about the relationship between genetics, power, and survival. The blood that binds us together as a species is not the concentrated essence of royal bloodlines, but the diverse, mixed, hybrid vigor of genetic diversity. The curse of royal inbreeding teaches us that our strength lies not in genetic purity, but in genetic complexity, not in isolation, but in integration, not in the preservation of ancient bloodlines, but in the constant renewal of the human gene pool. In the end, the The dark history of royal inbreeding illuminates a brighter truth about human nature and human potential. We are not prisoners of our genetic inheritance. We are not limited by the bloodlines of our ancestors. We are free to choose genetic diversity over genetic purity, biological health over political power, and human flourishing over dynastic tradition. The royals who tried to keep their blood pure discovered that pure blood becomes poisoned blood. Their tragedy became our education. Their curse became our blessing. Their genetic prison became our genetic freedom. The blood remembers everything. But now, finally, so do we. Thanks for watching No Sleep, Historian. Like and subscribe for more history they tried to erase. Until next time, keep one eye on the past. It still remembers you.